Okay, this video is going to actually cover all 12. So problems 1 through 12, which pretty much makes it all the Module 1 type questions from the 2017 group of released multiple choice items for the Keystones. So if you need to skip ahead, skip around, that should be easy to do, and feel free. But as always, please take the time to at least read the question over thoroughly. I'm not going to read the question for you usually. And please read it first thoroughly, at least once. Read it through enough times where you can try at least to wrap your brain around it and think of how you would do it or attempt to do it. And anyway, the music you might hear in the background is one of my favorite movie scores from the movie Last of the Mohicans. So anyway, the other thing I want to say before diving right in and plowing through all 12 different problems is it is 12 different problems, and I don't exactly have a script here. I'm kind of winging it in a way. So just kind of bear with me here and there. I might need a few seconds to get my bearings and think about the next problem, okay? All right, so number 1, and again, hopefully you've already read this over for yourself and thought about it. So they want you to figure out which one of these is true, an actual true statement based on this interval, okay? When 0.1 is less than or equal to x, which in turn is less than or equal to 0.4, and you have to know, this is something I want to emphasize, this means that x is going to need to be in between 0.1 and 0.4, okay? Now, since it's a less than or equal to here and here, that means that x could actually equal 0.1 and x could actually equal 0.4, but also be anything in between, like 0.2 or 0.3 or 0.39 or 0.21. But essentially in this problem, I think the best way, or maybe the only way, is to basically just check each answer. And that is something you always got to be aware of that you can do. You got to be versatile, okay? If worst comes to worst, or I don't know if that's the best way to say it, but always keep in the back of your mind that with multiple choice, you may just be able to check the correctness of each answer and kind of work backwards from all these possible choices. And I think that's like the only, correct me if I'm wrong, that might be the only thing you can do is kind of check to see if this one's right for, let's say, how about 0.2? What if you were to just plug in 0.2 in for the x just to see if it works? Okay, like 0.2 is definitely a valid number from this compound inequality. And so if you were to plug in 0.2 for these x's, the inequality would become, and I'm approximating here on some of these, about 0.447 is greater than about 0.04. So is that true? Is 0.447 actually greater than 0.04? And the answer, of course, is yes. Okay? So it seems like we've struck gold right away. We've checked, we're going in alphabetical order. You try choice A and it's like, I think it's choice A. But listen, you should always be more safe than sorry. And even though I'm pretty sure it's choice A right now, let's check the other ones because you never know. Okay? So if you were to plug in 0.2 in for these x's, you would end up, if you were to square it and if you were to divide it by 2, you'd get 0.04 is greater than 0.1. And you think to yourself, is that true? And that is not true. This number is not greater than that number, so this is erroneous, okay? And then if you were to plug in 0.2 in for option C and decide, is that true? Not even close. That's not greater than that. And if you were to plug in 0.2 in for option D, you'd get this, which again, not true. So in fact, it is A. So why don't I go ahead and actually, and moving on to number 2. Okay, let's see here. Greatest common factor. Hopefully you've already read this through and thought about it. Greatest common factor, GCF of x cubed y to the k. Okay. So here's the thing, people. They're trying to make this a little more complicated than a normal GCF question. They're telling you what the final GCF would be, and in order for like this to be the final GCF, what would k have to be? Now, I guess really quick I can think of to at least review the fact that, you know, when you are figuring out a GCF and you're talking about like x to the third and x to the seventh, you know, the GCF of x to the third and x to the seventh, for example, maybe I'll write this down, okay? A shortcut is to just kind of go with the smaller of the two exponents. So that's kind of a rule of thumb for finding GCF between like x to something and x to something else. So I guess to put it over, to kind of put it into this context, x to the third and x to the something, the final GCF is going to be x to the third. So I know 2 times whatever k is going to be equal to 3 or larger than 3 for like the final GCF answer to be x to the third. Anyway, here's my method. Okay, I'm going to say that you should literally, again, let's run through the choices. What if k equaled 1? What if I just let k equal 1? Let's see if that makes any sense. And if you let k equal 1, you got, look, this would become this, and x to the 2k, y to the 4 would become this if you allow k to equal 1. Now, is the GCF of these two monomials equal to x to the third, y to the third? What's the GCF of x to the third and x to the second? Well, guess what? It's not x to the third, it's x to, so it's going to be x to the second. All right? Now, I hate to drag this out more than I have to, but in the interest of being thorough, okay, the GCF of this would actually be x to the second, because you're comparing x to the third, x to the second, and y to the first, because you're comparing y to the first and y to the fourth, and the smaller of the two exponents is 1. So basically, it's not option A. And if you were to literally check if k were supposed to equal 2, you'd get this. Now think to yourself, is the GCF of these two what it needs to be? And okay, so x to the third, x to the fourth. All right, that is x to the third. And if you compare y to the second and y to the fourth, you get y to the second, which no go. So it was not that, and it was not that. And if we move on to checking C, and if we again, I hope you understand how this is working. What if I let k equal 3? You know, what if and that would make it y to the third, and it would make this 2 times 3, which is 6. And then you're going to see, am I actually getting the GCF I'm supposed to get? So sorry to be repetitive, but I want to be thorough, okay? So if you compare x to the third and x to the sixth, the smaller exponent for the x's is x to the third. And if you compare y to the third and y to the fourth, the smaller exponent is y to the third. And that's what we need. So it seems like we've finally struck gold with option C, but just to kind of be very, very extra thorough, if you let k equal 4, you're going to be getting these two, which you'd be getting x to the third, but you would get y to the fourth. So yep, that confirms it. It's C. Moving on to number 3. Just something I want to review really quick. When you have x to the second to the fourth, when you're raising something to a power that already has a power, in other words, you are raising a power to a power, you have to know what you're supposed to do with the exponents, okay, in order to simplify that. When you're doing a power to a power, that means you do what? You multiply the exponents. So it's no surprise all of these final answers, at least, are correct and x to the 8th. But how are we arriving really like in a way at x to the 8th? Well, long story short, and again, I hope you've already looked at all these choices and thought about this and read the question before watching me do this. It's going to be D. Because x to the 2nd to the 4th, when you raise something to the 4th power, that means you multiply it by itself 4 times. So x to the 2nd times x to the 2nd times x to the 2nd times x to the 2nd. That's what it means to raise something to the 4th power. And I think that's all I really need to say, at least for now. Let's move on to number 4. Okay. When factored completely. That's a big theme on the Keystones, is factoring, okay? So when they mention the word factored or factoring or just factor, it's gonna mean you're gonna factor. So you have to know how to factor things. Now, obviously this, you should realize, is the polynomial that we're going to factor. Now, again, to be kind of make sure I'm thorough, you need to know that the first method of factoring you should always try is factoring out a greatest common factor, a GCF. All right, that is the first method you should always try. Now, does 6x cubed minus 12x squared minus 40x, do they have any factors in common? Yes, they do. So you have to realize that the first thing you do here is factor out a GCF. Now, what's the greatest factor that all these terms have in common? Think about it. Pause the video if you have to. Okay. 6x. The greatest common factor is 6x. And when you factor that out of all the terms, what you're left with is x to the 2nd minus 2x minus 8. Again, in a way, you're undistributing, okay? You're undistributing, you're dividing out 6x from all those terms, okay? Now, look, another thing you got to keep in mind with factoring, in general, is that even after you factor out a GCF, you should always check to see if the bubble that is left over, this factor, this bubble factor, maybe it can be factored again by what a lot of teachers and textbooks call unfoil. Maybe we can factor this bubble into 2 bubbles, okay? And it turns out that we can. Obviously there's another box here. So, again, to kind of be thorough and review all the details, how do you factor this into 2 bubbles? Well, since it's x squared, the bubbles are going to start off with just x. And then you got to think about what 2 numbers, to review here, multiply to get -8, the last number, but they also, the same 2 numbers, add up to -2. So think to yourself right now, what 2 numbers multiply to make -8, but also add up to -2? And definitely my advice is start with that question, okay? Like, think of numbers that multiply to get -8, even write them down, like even go off on the side and go, well, -1 and +8, but also +1 and -8, and +2 and -4, and -2 and +4, and literally write out all the possibilities that are going to multiply to get -8 if you have to. But anyway, cutting to the chase, it turns out that the 2 numbers that are going to do the trick, because they also add up to -2, are -4 and +2. So now it's fully factored. I did GCF and I did unfoil, or factoring into 2 bubbles. All right, the just quick and easy method of making 2 bubbles. There you go, Birch. And it turns out now that we've factored it, we can look over here and go, which one of these choices is a factor? And it turns out that, there we go. So see how we have a factor of x plus 2, and therefore it is a. So moving on to number 5. Number 5, okay. Hopefully you've read this already. Pause it if you have to read it. Now, okay. So again, I got to get my bearings here. So each cupcake costs $1.15. There's a delivery fee of $10.95, and just like a lot of Keystone questions, people, it is super important to notice what they want X to represent, which in this case is the number of cupcakes ordered, and what your Y you can't think of the correct equation unless you are really understanding what X is filling in for and is unknown for, and what Y is. And Y is the total cost. So look, there's not much I can do to really help you and explain to you what the final answer is, I guess, but I'll say what I can. If every cupcake costs $1.15 and X is the number of cupcakes, it makes a lot of sense to multiply the 115 with X. You know, if you ordered 20 cupcakes and you wanted to figure out how much money that's going to amount to, wouldn't you multiply the 20 cupcakes by the price for each cupcake? I mean, that's just the way it goes in real life. So it makes a lot of sense that in the equation you're going to want to multiply 115 with X, with the X variable. And again, X is right now the unknown. We don't know the number of cupcakes, so it's got to be X. X number of cupcakes. But there's also this one-time delivery fee of $10.95 that also has to be added on top of that. So long story short, too late, the equation that makes sense is C. So let me just read this out before we move on. Because equation C, you could think of it as saying this. You ready? The total cost will equal the price for each cupcake times the number of cupcakes plus the delivery fee. Okay, moving on. Number 6. Well, this one is just about, hopefully you've read this already. This one's just about going like, well, we go from here to here to here, and they want you to figure out which statement would correctly describe what's happening here, okay? I really hope you can easily figure out that how do we go from step 1 to step 2? We are using the distributive property. Please know about the distributive property for more ways than one. Please know how the distributive property works before going into the Keystone exam. And that's obviously what's happening here. And it looks like Kylie did it correctly because you have to distribute the 4 to both the X and the -8. And you have to distribute the 7. You have to multiply the 7 to both the X and the -4. So Kylie is correct. Rhonda is not correct. What choice does that say? Kylie uses... I think it's B. All right. Kylie uses the distributive property, resulting in a correct first step. Yeah, B. I'm going to go with B. And again, you want to be thorough, right? You want to kind of go like, well, it's not A because the associative property is not what's going on here. So that's out, you know. And then D, Rhonda, whatever, uses the distributive property. But no, Rhoda was not the correct one. Okay, moving on. Number 7. Okay, make sure you've read this already, please. Pause if you have to. Let me get my bearings here. So Darlene, they are, okay, this is definitely important. Y equals 2x plus 1. Again, please pay attention to that the x variable is filling in right now for the number of days. and that the y variable is filling in right now for the unknown number of prize tickets that Darlene has collected. Okay, now we go to the choices, and they want to know which statement correctly describes a solution. All right, people, reviewing this important concept, what does a solution to this equation even mean? Well, what it means is that you'd have a pair of numbers, an ordered pair, one number for x and one number for y, that would plug in, it would replace the x and replace the y to make that equation true. Okay? So I guess they're talking about, like, when, again, this is important things to notice and be aware of, and be heads up about going into the Keystone exam. That word solution is huge, especially in this problem. So which statement is describing a solution? So is it A, Darlene has collected 2 prize tickets at the end of 1 day? So keeping in mind that 1 day would go in for X, and the number 2 is for prize tickets, that goes in for Y. So that's just an example of, well, choice A is basically saying, does X equal 1 and Y equals 2? Well, let's see. Choice A is basically saying if I were to plug in 2 for Y and 1 for X, would that actually make it true? Is 2 equal to 2 times 1 plus 1? And it's not. So it's not A. Okay? But what, and then again, I'm trying to kind of fast track this. For B, it's like, well, 9 days. So what if X were to equal 9? Like, what if you plugged in 9 for X, and what if you plugged in 4 for Y? Would that satisfy the equation? Okay? Is 4 equal to 2 times 9 plus 1? Not even close. Not even close. So choice C, so it's not B. Choice C, what if you plugged in 22 for Y and X for 10? Is 22 equal to 2 times 10 plus 1? No. So it seems like we have to go through all of them before we get to D. But hey, let's be sure that it's actually D. So if I thought of the correct number for X being 12, and the correct, let's see, if we plugged in 25 for Y and 12 for X, is that actually true? 2 times 12 is 24, plus 1, that does equal 25, and so the answer is D. Moving on. Number 8. Okay? Hopefully you've read this already. If not, pause it and read it, please, and think about it, please, before continuing on. So here we go. We got Mary, who's got plant A, which was 1 inch tall at the beginning and grew ½ an inch per day. Plant B, different story. On which day were plant A and plant B the same height? Okay. Once again, you got to be aware on the Keystones that with multiple choice, a lot of the time you can just check each answer one by one. You can see if, well, what would the 2 heights be after 5 days? You could calculate how tall plant A would be, how tall plant B would be, and just kind of run through the choices, checking each answer. That strategy works for more multiple choice questions than you might think, okay? Please be aware of that. I can't emphasize that enough. I'm going to be a broken record about that. What you also could do for this question number 8, a different sort of strategy but similar, is kind of make a table, or kind of like a day-by-day chart, a day-by-day, what am I trying to say? Keeping keeping a data. I'm sorry, I'm struggling here with my words, but just kind of like a day-by-day table. Like, okay, after 1 day, plant A grew half an inch. So after one day, plant A was 1.5 inches tall, and after one day, plant B was 3.25 inches tall. And then after 2 days, they were both this, and after 3 days, they were this. And just kind of like make a log day by day. There it is, maybe. But that's another way. But here's a third way to do it. And, you know, if one of those first two options makes more sense, please do that. But you could also make an equation for each plant and set them equal to each other, you know. And more than anything else here, this is for me to get to the correct answer and basically solve for D. So plant A's height is always going to be 0.5 times whatever the number of days have been plus 1. And then plant B's equation, or for the height, is always going to be 0.25 times how many days have passed plus the original height of 3. And so you can like set these two heights equal to each other to see like what value for D would make these two heights equal. And now I just have to solve for D. So this should be 0.25 D plus 1 equals 3. And then I can start to get D by itself. Sorry, what was that? And finally, I would be dividing both sides by 0.25. And 2 divided by 0.25 should be 8. And again, before we move on to number 9, you could have done that by guessing and checking each answer, just making a day-by-day log, you know, and or doing it this fancy schmancy equation way. Number 9. This one involves a absolute value inequality. All right? One of the less commonly remembered types of problems, types of inequalities to know what to do with it. So, definitely a good one to cover. They basically want you to figure out, obviously, which graph matches this inequality. So this is the big review point. This is the big idea. With absolute value inequalities, what you want to do is isolate the absolute value, which is already done, and then you want to break it up into two cases. As the famous Mr. Birchanowski would say, there are two vertical lines that make up the absolute value notation. You know, an absolute value has these two vertical lines. That means that there's two different cases. And case number 1, when you drop the absolute value, is just going to be 2x minus 7 is greater than 3. And the other case is going to be where you reverse the symbol into a less than, or whatever the reverse of it is going to be. In this case, you reverse the greater than to a less than, and you also make this number into a negative, okay? So notice how the changes we made for our case number 2. And now you're definitely, that's huge. And now you're off and running where you can solve this for x. And I don't have much room here, so I'm going to take some liberties. I'm going to add 7 to both sides and then divide both sides by positive 2. And that should be 5 when I get x by itself, because that's how you know what the graph is going to look like. And, you know, dot, dot, dot. Again, I don't have the room to do all the written out steps. When I add, but you should. Don't do this stuff in your head, please. I'm going to add 7 to both sides to get a 4. And add 7. See, it's better to write this down. Like even I'm not comfortable doing all this in my head, okay? But you're going to add 7 to both sides to make a 4, and then you divide that 4 by 2. So that is what it should be. I hope it's correct, okay? If not, I'm sure I'll catch it or you'll catch it or something. Anyway, it's important to realize that, well, I guess you could really get away with maybe not even knowing specifically what the word is supposed to be that would technically connect these two separate inequalities. But one good rule of thumb, and I'll even write this down somewhere, is greater than or and less than and. So if it was a greater than or maybe, you know what? The better one might be more than or. So more than or, and if it was a less than, it would have been an and. And as long as I'm reviewing things that are, in general, things to review, if it's an or, then most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, the two graphs are going to be separate and running away from each other. And if it was an and that connected the two inequalities, most of the time the graphs are going to be colliding with each other, going towards each other. So x is greater than 5 or less than 2. Well, greater than 5. And again, something else to kind of review, when the symbol does not have a line underneath, when the symbol does not include the or equal to, then the circles on the graphs are going to be open and not filled in, okay? And if it was a greater than or less than or equal to, then it would be like a filled in dot on the graph. So not something you have to worry about when you're choosing between A, B, C, and D, but it's something you need to know, okay? So sorry for being extra thorough. But x is greater than 5, okay, that checks out. Or x is less than 2. So it seems to be A, but just want to make sure that it's not C, that it's not D, and that it's not B. No, it's A. All right? Number 10. Read this, please, first. And the solution set of an inequality is shown below. Which inequality has the solution? Okay. So essentially, which one of these, when you were to solve it, would end up with that graph? So, I mean, something I just thought of to do. You should know that this graph is essentially saying that x is greater than or equal to 2. Just to remind you again that when it's a filled-in circle, you need that or equal to. And all this stuff here is everything that's greater than 2. So, long story short, when you get x by itself here, essentially multiplying both sides by -4, or I guess you could think of it as multiplying both sides by 4, but then you'd have to divide both sides by -1. And something you want to keep in mind, all right, listen, is that whenever you multiply or divide both sides by a negative number, you need to flip or reverse the symbol. So that's why in option A, it ended up being less than or equal to 2, because at some point, whether right away or in your second step, you're going to have to divide or multiply both sides by a negative number to get x by itself, okay? And that flips it to a less than or equal to. Again, cutting to the chase, multiplying both sides by -4, okay? And you realize that, sorry that keeps happening. D, check each answer once again. Number 11. Please, I know that a lot of words, a lot of reading, okay? But please read this first, twice, 3 times before having me go through it for you. And think, please think long and hard about how you would do this, please, okay? All right, now that you've unpaused, let me get my bearings here. So a t-shirt company wants to make a profit of more than $3,500. So that's important. And let's stick with purple. Go Donatello. The best of the Ninja Turtles by far. So profit of more than, that's some keywords, people. And charges $20 per t-shirt and has $1,500 in monthly costs. And they go ahead and they give you this inequality saying 20x minus 1,500 is greater than 3,500, and that models the situation. And it looks like they just want you to be able to analyze this inequality and think about what would x be representing based on all the information. Obviously, we know that 20 is what they charge per t-shirt. 1,500 is what they have in monthly costs, and 3,500 is what they want to have be the profit. Okay, so if you think about it, why are they subtracting the 1,500? Because that's the costs, you know. And so what do you think you'd need to multiply to the 20? So like, what is this x? What would you be multiplying by the charge per t-shirt? Well, wouldn't it be the number of t-shirts? So looking at the choices, the profit made from this, no. The profit made from, no, I don't even know what the heck is going on with that. 1 month, okay, because of the monthly costs. Sorry, okay, that does make more sense than I thought. But still wrong. Part C, the number of t-shirts that need to be sold for the company to meet its goal. Part D, the number of t-shirts that need to be sold for the company to recover its monthly costs. I think the fact that they are already doing like this minus 1,500 and that need to be more than 3,500, that says to me that it is C. Moving on to the final question. So number 12. This one, now that you've hopefully already read this through and thought about it, this one just gives a system of inequalities, and this is very straightforward. Which graph matches this system of inequalities? Well, cutting to the chase, I don't know if you can really do that until you've gotten both inequalities into what's essentially slope-intercept form. What does that mean? That means y all by itself on one side and the other side being mx plus b. Now this inequality, you should already be able to go to the line and start thinking about what the graph would be, because you can see that, well, let's use a different color. You can already see that the m value is going to be -1/2, which is your slope, and your b value is going to be 3. And that your shading, well, really, first of all, because the symbol is less than or equal to, that means the line is going to be solid. That's something you got to remember, that whenever it's a less than or equal to or greater than or equal to, the line is solid. But looking at A, B, C, and D, all those different choices, doesn't seem like that's going to be a deciding factor or anything to worry about, but you still have to know it. And also with the less than or equal to, that means the shading is going to be below. But there's the other inequality, which needs to be solved for y. So you have to realize that in order for me to figure out what the graph of that other one's going to look like, we have to solve for y, which means subtracting x to the other side to start to get y by itself. That's the first move. And then realizing, once again, that these do not mix. So these two terms are going to stay separate over here on the right side. And if we want it to be in true mx plus b order form, we want to put the negative x first and then the minus 2. And then, still needing to get y by itself, what are we going to do? We're going to divide both sides by 2, making sure we divide the entire right side by 2, both terms by 2. So what's negative x, or negative 1x divided by 2? Well, can we do negative 1 divided by 2? Not cleanly. And so it's kind of like a fraction, which, does it reduce? You want to reduce it if you can, but it will not reduce, so that stays negative 1/2 x. And then we also have to do negative 2 divided by 2, which is negative 1. So now, okay, now we know that this m value is going to be negative 1/2, and the b value is going to be negative 1. And now we can start to see, oh, and also again, by the way, really quick, because of the greater than or equal to, it's going to be a solid line, but this time it's a greater than dynamic to it, so we're going to shade above. You got to know details like that, like where to shade based on the symbol, if it's solid or dashed based on the symbol, and stuff like that. So, looking through these 4 graphs, and then don't get impatient and don't get frustrated. Take your time, it's all right. The slopes need to be both negative. So when you look at A and B, you know, this slope goes up 1, right 2, and so with this one. So you can pretty much, well, I don't know, you can pretty much cancel out A and B, all right? And then when you look at C and D and you think about how the slopes are correct, you know, they go down 1, right 2 for both the lines. But the y-intercepts, I think, is what's going to be the ultimate deciding factor. And it turns out that because you have a y-intercept here of 3 and a y-intercept here of negative 1, then it's going to be C. And just to be super thorough and descriptive here, so this guy has a solid line of, well, this is the one where it's negative 1/2 x plus 3, and I just want to emphasize that the shading was supposed to be, you know, below that guy, but the shading for the other guy that had a y-intercept of negative 1 and a slope of negative 2, that shading was going to be above. And so that's why the shadings sort of like doubled up in between. It's just extra reason why the final answer was C. Okay?